And so for this project, I encourage you to use any size 4 medium weight yarn that you have. Worsted weight yarn, anything that isn't too bulky will probably work great for this project. And these are optional, but you might find it helpful to grab 2 scrap pieces of yarn or 2 stitch markers for this project. And I am going to be using a size J or 10 or 6 millimeter crochet hook. But if you don't have a crochet hook of this exact size, that's fine. Just get as close as you can. And if you're working with yarn that is in a skein, I wanted to show you that you want to pull the yarn from one of the ends here. So usually when you get a new skein of yarn, there will be sort of an end sticking out of the middle of one of the ends of your skein. That's where you want to pull your yarn. And if for some reason you can't find the yarn at either end here, then go ahead and remove the cover and find the other end of yarn. But you really don't want to use that while you're crocheting because it will just make your skein constantly turn. So I encourage you to roll your yarn in a ball and then pick up from there. So now that you have your end of yarn, go ahead and grab it, and we are going to attach this yarn to our crochet hook using a slip knot. So you want to have your crochet hook handy, and what you're going to do is you're going to form a loop with your yarn. So hold on to the end of it, and then drape your yarn over that end, just like this. Then you're going to pinch that intersection and insert 2 of your fingers into that loop like this. Then you're just going to pick up your long end of your yarn. So not the tail here, but the actual working yarn. And you're going to draw it up through your loop. Then you're going to hold on to this end of your working yarn and your tail and just sort of pull everything together. So you've created your slip knot, and so now you're going to insert your crochet hook in your loop and then pull on your working yarn and your tail to tighten that slip knot against your crochet hook. And you don't really want this to be too tight. So you want there to be a little bit of a gap between your crochet hook and the actual knot. But if you do tighten it too tight, that's okay. Just sort of wiggle your crochet hook and pull the knot out slightly. So before we begin, I want to show you how to hold your yarn. So there are a couple of terms that you probably want to become familiar with, and that is your tail, which is the end here, and then your working yarn, and this is the yarn that you're going to be working with that's attached to your skein. So go ahead and grab your crochet hook with your dominant hand. So for me, that's my right hand. And with your other hand, you're going to drape the yarn over your pinky and then over your index finger. And you might have to position that close to your crochet hook, but that's how you want to hold your yarn. And so this way we can control the tension of the yarn with our fingers. And I encourage you to try to hold your yarn pretty loosely while you crochet, but there are times when you need to tighten it up so that you can make a stitch. So now that you know how to hold your yarn, what you're going to do is grab onto your tail like this. And you might have to redo the hold on your yarn to get it a little closer, and that's fine. So grab onto your tail and we're going to form a chain stitch. So to do that, wrap your crochet hook around your working yarn like this. And you want to make sure that it's captured in the hook portion. Then you're going to pull the working yarn through the loop on your crochet hook. And so now you've created a chain stitch right here. You can see that it's formed a V, and that's your first chain stitch right there. And then you also have a new loop on your crochet hook. So for your additional chain stitches, you're going to wrap your crochet hook around your working yarn. Make sure you capture it in that hook and then draw it through the loop on your crochet hook. So now you've created 2 chains. So we need to create 14 more. So you're just going to keep practicing that stitch. And as you can see, I am holding on to my previous stitches, just like this. And that helps me create a more consistent stitch. So you just want to find the place that feels the most comfortable for you and hold on to that while you place your chain stitches. And again, we are chaining 16. So I'm going to show you how to count your chain stitches. So you're going to count the V stitches like this, and each of these is your individual chain stitch. But that might be a little bit difficult to identify at first, and if it is, that's fine. Go ahead and just pick one of your loops, so either your back loop or your front loop here, and count those instead. So you would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. If for some reason you made too many chain stitches or you need to back out stitches in your project, all you do is just remove your crochet hook, and then you're going to pull on your working yarn here. So there I am just removing chain stitch by chain stitch. So whenever I get to the point where I'm done removing stitches, then I'm going to insert my crochet hook back in that loop. And you can tell that you've inserted your crochet hook in the right loop if you pull it and it pulls on your working yarn. So there aren't any other loops that will pull like that. So now we can pull on our working yarn to tighten it back down on our crochet hook. I'm just going to replace those 3 chains. So once you have your chain 16 in place, then what we're going to do is turn our work. So basically, we're just going to turn our crochet hook so that we can work back on top of the stitches that we just created. And you're going to want to have your stitch markers handy. So for our next row, we're going to skip our last 2 chain stitches here. And we're going to work in the 3rd chain from our crochet hook here. And we're only going to be working in the back loop. So this is the loop that's furthest away from you when you're looking at your stitch, and that's right here. And in that back loop, we're going to place a double crochet. So to make a double crochet stitch, you're going to yarn over, which just means you're going to wrap your crochet hook around your working yarn, and then you're going to insert your crochet hook in the back loop of that 3rd chain. So now you should have 3 loops on your crochet hook. From here, we're going to yarn over and pull through that back loop only. So now again, you should have 3 loops on your crochet hook. From here, we're going to yarn over and drop 2 loops. So now we have 2 loops on our crochet hook. Then we're going to yarn over and drop our last 2 loops. And so we have now created our first double crochet stitch. So what I'm going to recommend is that we go ahead and put one of our stitch markers in the top of our first double crochet stitch right here. This isn't entirely necessary, but it does make it a lot easier when it comes to placing your subsequent rows. So go ahead and remove your crochet hook, and then directly beside this loop where we pulled our crochet hook out, right here, that's where you want to place your stitch marker. So your crochet hook loop should actually be sort of through this loop where we're placing the stitch marker. And if you're using a scrap piece of yarn, you can just slide it through your stitch. And I know when I first started out that I would tie like a little bow here. So now I've reinserted my crochet hook and I've marked the top of my first double crochet stitch with a sort of makeshift stitch marker. From here, we're going to continue placing one double crochet in each of our back loops. So we're going to locate our next chain stitch right here beside the one we just worked in. And in the back loop, we're going to yarn over and then insert our crochet hook in that back loop. Again, we have 3 loops on our crochet hook. So now we're going to yarn over and pull up through the back loop. And we should have 3 loops on our crochet hook. Then we're going to yarn over and drop 2 loops, and then yarn over and drop our last 2 loops. So you can see here that we've created 2 double crochet stitches. And you can also tell your double crochet stitches by these sort of posts that your double crochet stitches make. So again, you can count these posts or the top of your stitches here. So we're going to place another double crochet. So we're going to yarn over and then insert our crochet hook in our next back loop right here. Then we're going to yarn over again and pull up through our loop, and then yarn over and drop 2 loops and yarn over and drop our last 2 loops. So now we have completed 3 of our double crochet stitches, and I hope that you have the hang of them now, but I'll show you a couple of more in case you don't. Yarn over and then insert your crochet hook in that next back loop. Yarn over, pull up through the loop, and then yarn over and drop 2 loops, and yarn over and drop your last 2 loops. Now we've completed 4 double crochet stitches, and I'll show you one more. Go ahead and yarn over and then insert your crochet hook in your next back loop. Yarn over, pull up through that back loop, yarn over and drop 2 loops, and then yarn over and drop your last 2 loops. So now we have 5 double crochets. I'm going to go ahead and just finish out the row, placing 1 double crochet in the back loop only of each stitch in the row. So now when you get down toward your last loop, I know for a lot of people, this very first chain stitch can be pretty tight. If it's kind of hard for you to tell whether or not you're working in your last stitch, I'm going to give you a few pointers. The first pointer is find your slip knot. Hopefully your slip knot is nice and tight by now, but if not, you might find it helpful to hold on to your work and your tail and give it a nice pull. Just in case that's really loose, sometimes it can be confusing. So once you've determined that your slip knot is nice and tight, if there are any loops next to that that you haven't worked in, then you probably still have remaining stitches. So we're going to go ahead and place a double crochet in this last back loop. Another option that you have is to count your stitches. So again, just like our chains, you can count the V portion of your stitch, or you can count your posts. And this is where marking your first double crochet stitch can be super beneficial. So you kind of know where to begin counting your V's or your posts based on this. If you want to count the top of your stitches up here, then you just start with your stitch marker and move to your crochet hook. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12, 13, and 14 is this last one. Now we're going to go ahead and mark this last stitch with our other stitch marker. So let's say you got to the end of the row and you don't have any loops left next to your slip knot, but you don't have the correct number of stitches. More than likely, you just missed one of your chain stitches, especially if you counted your chain stitches and you know you had 16. There's a chance you could have placed your first double crochet in the wrong stitch, but honestly, since this is your first crochet project, don't worry too much about it. If you missed a stitch or added an additional stitch to your chain, it's not the end of the world, and you probably won't even notice. The important thing to note is how many double crochet stitches you have. Because if you can count the number of double crochet stitches that you have right now, then just make sure that you don't add or subtract any additional double crochet stitches going forward, and your project will look great and nobody will be able to tell that you missed a chain or added an additional stitch to a chain. But if it's difficult for you to count your stitches, it's definitely worth practicing, because the last thing you want to do is spend a lot of time on a project and notice that it's V'ing out or sort of turning in because you're not counting your stitches correctly. And that's why I highly recommend you use some stitch markers to sort of note the first and last stitch of each of your rows. So now we have marked that last stitch in our row. So we're going to chain 2 and turn our work. So we're literally going to take the work that we were working and turn it just like this. So now we're working on top of our previous row of double crochet stitches. So go ahead and note this stitch where you placed your stitch marker. So you can see here that you have your chain 2 and then your very last double crochet. So take note of that stitch while we remove the stitch marker. So now we're going to place a double crochet under both of these loops that form our stitch in that space where our stitch marker was, right here. Again, skipping our chain 2 altogether, and this is what's called a turning chain. So it allows us to turn our work without messing up the pattern. So now from here, we're going to yarn over and we're going to work under the full stitch. And so that's going to be both loops of our V right here. So each of these V's is the full stitch right here. Then what we're going to do is yarn over and drop the 2 V loops, just like this. So now we have 3 loops on our crochet hook. We're going to yarn over and drop 2, and then yarn over and drop 2 again. So now we've created the first double crochet of our next row, and we're going to go ahead and mark that just for a little while we're getting the hang of our rows. So now again, we've marked that first double crochet, and the pattern for our row is just to place double crochet stitches in each of our previous rows' double crochet stitches. And we will be working up underneath the full stitch. And so I'm going to show you that again, just so you know. It's these two loops right here that sort of form the top of our double crochet. And they should be worked in this gap between this third loop down here and then the top of the V. So when you're inserting your crochet hook, this is where you're going to be inserting it, right here in that gap. And again, make sure that you're dropping both loops of your stitch after your first yarn over. So you're going to yarn over and pull up through both of those loops. And then you're going to yarn over and drop 2 loops and yarn over and drop your last 2 loops. So now we've just created our second double crochet of this row. And we're just going to continue to place our double crochet stitches going all the way down our row. And we're just going to practice working up underneath the 2 loops that complete our full stitch. So now I'm getting close to the end of my row, and I know because I'm approaching that first stitch marker from our first row. So again, you can either move it to the side while you place your last double crochet, or you can pull it out. I'm just going to move mine to the side for now. So go ahead and place your last double crochet in that last stitch there. So now I'm just going to remove my stitch marker and then place it up in the stitch that I just finished. And so again, just like our previous row, you should have 14 total double crochets in our row we just completed. So from here, all we're going to do is just repeat that last row until this goes around our head comfortably. And that's really all we have to do. So I'm going to show you one more row just so you don't have to rewind it. But after that, you're on your own and you can practice your double crochet stitch all you want. So to begin our next row, we're going to chain 2. And again, we're going to turn our work like this. So now you can see here that we have our chain 2 and then this first double crochet stitch that we marked with our stitch marker. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. So now I'm going to place 1 double crochet back in that stitch that we just marked by yarning over and inserting my crochet hook under both loops that form that V. Then I'm going to yarn over, and drop those 2 loops that form the V. And then I'm going to yarn over and drop 2 loops and yarn over and drop our last 2 loops. And again, I think you might find it helpful if you place a stitch marker back in that stitch that you just created. And sometimes you can just draw your yarn through. You don't have to create a nice bow or anything. So now we're just going to continue to place 1 double crochet in each of the stitches in our row. So again, we should have 14 double crochets when we're done. And again, you know when you're on your last stitch because this is the stitch with your stitch marker from your previous row. So I'm just going to go ahead and place my double crochet stitch, and then I'm going to insert my stitch marker in that stitch. And we've just completed another row of our headband. So like I said before, we're just going to keep repeating that pattern of 14 double crochets in each row until the headband is long enough to fit around our head. And I will meet back up with you there. And I crocheted my headband for a total of 29 rows of double crochets. And everyone crochets a little bit different as well, so it's completely fine if you had to increase or decrease the number of rows to make this comfortable. And so what we're going to do is we are literally going to crochet our individual stitches together to join our two short edges. So at the end of your very last row, I want you to go ahead and chain 1. Then line your two short edges together. So here on the side that we just finished crocheting in our last row, we're going to be working underneath our full double crochet stitches, just like we've been doing for the entire pattern. But working back in this first row, we only really have one loop available to work in. So if you remember, we did work only in the back loop of our chains, so that sort of freed up these front loops right here to work in. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin by inserting our crochet hook in our first double crochet stitch right here. Then on this opposite edge, we're going to insert our crochet hook in our first front loop right here. So again, this should be directly beside your original slip knot. So now that you've inserted your crochet hook in your first front loop, you're just going to yarn over and pull through all the loops on your crochet hook for a slip stitch. Just like that. So now you just completed your first slip stitch. So we're going to move on to our next double crochet stitch and our next front loop right here. And again, we're just going to yarn over and pull through all of our loops. So that is all we're going to do to join our two short edges. And again, you know, it's okay. You might miss a stitch here and there when you're doing this. So you can always clean this up a little bit at the end, and I'll show you how to do that. So once you've joined all of your stitches, you might notice that maybe one side has more stitches than the other. Maybe you missed a stitch somewhere along the way, or maybe you just had your count a little off. If that's the case, go ahead and back out about halfway down your headband, and on the side that was a little bit longer, you're just going to every once in a while skip the number of stitches that it was over. And that should line you up at the end. There's no reason to go back and try to figure out where you added additional stitches or anything like that. It won't really matter in the end when you're wearing your headband. So we're going to do one final thing before we tie off our yarn, and that is we're going to insert our crochet hook in the gap of our chain 2 turning chains on both sides. So right here, and then on this other side right here. And this is just next to your turning chains. So you're not actually working in any of the loops, but just sort of in this gap at the end of each of your rows. So right here. And this is just an option. It just cleans it up a little bit. And we're just going to place a slip stitch there. So now that you have joined your two short edges, we're going to tie off our yarn. So the way that I like to do that is I just pull my loop a little bit out and then I'm going to cut off my yarn. With my crochet hook in my loop, I just take the tail and yarn over and pull through with it. Make sure it's nice and tight. And that's all you have to do to tie off your yarn. So now we're going to hide our two tails, our starting and ending tail, along this ridge here. And there really isn't a right way to do this, but for me, I find it easiest if I just work under the stitches that I created. And we're going to be turning our headband inside out, so you don't need to completely hide your tails. But see, I'm just weaving my tail in and out through the stitches here. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. And once you get it sort of to the center, you really want to make sure that you leave enough room that if this gets pulled, it's not going to show up in the front of the project. So sometimes it's helpful just to give it a couple of pulls. And now that you've tucked your tails into that ridge, just turn your headband inside out. And as you can see here, this is the seam that we created doing that, and it's not even really that visible. And if you're interested in more tutorials for absolute beginners, let me know in the comments below. I typically don't do videos like this, but I'm definitely open to it. So if you enjoyed this, I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on ways I can do a better job, or what you liked about this video in particular. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful, awesome day.